What if your dog could sense disaster before it struck? Rocky, a loyal German shepherd with an uncanny ability to predict earthquakes, watches over the family he loves. As a massive earthquake threatens Los Angeles, his family is forced to face the reality of a disaster none of them were prepared for. Will Rocky's instincts be enough to save them? Or will their tight-knit family be torn apart in ways they never saw coming? It was a crisp morning in Los Angeles, the kind of day where the sun hung lazily in the sky, casting long shadows across the suburban streets. The air smelled faintly of exhaust, but also the blooming jasmine from the garden next door. In a neighborhood where everyone was always busy, it was easy to forget that this area sat on one of the most active earthquake faults in the country. The threat of disaster was there, but it was always distant, always something that might never come. At the Miller family's home, life was in full swing. The family of 5 was bustling through their morning routine. The father, John Miller, was already at the kitchen counter, hunched over his laptop, sipping his coffee with furrowed brows as he reviewed the blueprint for his next construction project. At 50, John was the reliable rock of the family. He'd built the business from the ground up, had worked long hours to make sure they never went without, and had always insisted on providing a stable, grounded life for his wife and children. But there were cracks in his armor. His career took up much of his time, leaving him often absent during the small but important moments that defined family life. His wife, Emma, was bustling in the kitchen, making breakfast for their 3 children. She was the heart of the household, nurturing but fiercely protective. At 48, Emma had spent her life raising her family, keeping everything running smoothly, and supporting her husband through the most trying of times. She always made sure there was food on the table, homework done, and a hug ready when anyone needed it. The kids, though, were more of a challenge. Ethan, the 15-year-old son, was already on his phone, his headphones in as he grumbled about not having enough time to eat breakfast. His usual rebellious nature was only intensified by the fact that he was trying to navigate his teen years while living in a home where expectations were high. He was a good kid, but he had little patience for authority, especially his father. Luke, the 13-year-old, was already finishing his breakfast and watching cartoons. The middle child was quieter than his brother but no less determined. He was far more sensitive than Ethan, always eager to help out and follow the rules, but eager to please his older sibling in every way he could. And then there was Emily, their 5-year-old daughter, sitting in the corner, playing with her stuffed toys. Her laughter was infectious, and her innocent eyes were often the light that brought the whole family together, even during the darkest moments. Amidst the morning chaos, the family's German shepherd, Rocky, sat by the back door, his sharp eyes constantly scanning the house. His fur was sleek and well-groomed, his muscular frame betraying his strength despite his calm demeanor. Rocky was more than just a pet, he was a member of the family, ever watchful, always protective, and fiercely loyal. Though he was a playful dog, eager to run and fetch, there was something about him that always seemed alert, as if he was always aware of things that others weren't. Rocky had been with the Millers since he was a pup. John had gotten him for Emma as a birthday gift when she had expressed a desire for a dog to help with the kids. Rocky had grown up alongside the children, always in the background, whether keeping watch over the house or playing in the backyard with the kids. However, in recent weeks, something about Rocky had changed. His behavior had become more unpredictable. When Ethan had come home late one evening, he found Rocky pacing the floor, growling softly under his breath. Luke had noticed the same thing a few nights before. Rocky had refused to leave the kitchen, staring intently at the walls. Even Emily had started asking questions about why Rocky barked at the same spot in the yard, seemingly agitated and anxious for no apparent reason. John had chalked it up to the usual dog quirks. "He's just being protective, Emma. You know how he is," John would say. But deep down, there was something unsettling about it, a feeling that couldn't be explained. This morning, though, was different. As the family sat down to breakfast, Rocky didn't follow his usual routine. He stayed by the door, his ears twitching, his body tense. He was staring out the window into the backyard, his nostrils flaring as he inhaled deeply, picking up every scent that the wind carried. Emma noticed first, the silence around the house, a stark contrast to his usual playfulness. "John, do you see Rocky? He's acting weird again." Emma's voice was laced with concern. John glanced over, his eyes narrowing as he set his coffee down. "He's probably just hungry. He's been cooped up all night." But something in the dog's posture told a different story. Rocky didn't move from the door, nor did he show interest in his breakfast bowl. His eyes remained fixed, unblinking, his body still but alert. It was as if he was waiting for something, anticipating something, but Emma couldn't understand what. "Hey, buddy. Everything okay?" John called out, rising from his seat to approach the dog. As he stepped closer, Rocky's growl deepened, his fur bristling. "What's wrong, boy?" John asked again, his tone growing more serious. Rocky's head turned slightly, meeting John's eyes. His gaze was focused, intense, like he was trying to tell him something. For a moment, the room fell silent. Then, suddenly, the ground beneath them shook, gently at first, and then with increasing intensity. The windows rattled, the walls groaned, and the familiar hum of the city outside was drowned in the deafening sound of the earthquake's first tremor. Emma's hand flew to her mouth, her heart leaping in her chest. Earthquake. The earthquake had come and gone, leaving behind an uneasy silence that felt almost unnatural. The tremors had lasted only a few seconds, but in those few seconds, the house seemed to shudder under the weight of something far bigger than anyone could have imagined. As soon as it stopped, the Miller family rushed outside to check for damage. The sky was clear, and there were no cracks in the walls of the house, no visible signs of destruction. The neighborhood, too, seemed relatively untouched. Yet the unease lingered in the air, thick and heavy. Rocky had stopped growling when the tremors stopped, but his ears were still alert, his body rigid. He didn't leave the yard. He didn't run to the front door or the kitchen like usual. Instead, he stayed by the fence, staring out into the street, his nose twitching, the hairs on the back of his neck raised. "Did anyone else feel that?" Ethan asked, his voice sharp with confusion. He had seen earthquakes before, there was always a jolt, a shaking, but this felt different. Unnatural. John stood up, brushing his hands off as if to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. It was small, just a quick one. Nothing to worry about. Emma stood a few feet away, wringing her hands. "I don't know. Rocky's been acting strange lately." Her eyes flicked to the dog, who remained perfectly still, his body tense as if he had sensed something more. But John had already dismissed it. Dogs have instincts. He waved it off. "We're fine. Just a little aftershock. Nothing we can't handle." His usual confidence was now tinged with an edge of doubt. Despite his calm exterior, a nagging feeling simmered in his chest. But the thought was fleeting. He had other things on his mind: work, the bills, and the usual day-to-day grind. They needed to rebuild, and an earthquake, no matter how small, was just one of the risks that came with living in Los Angeles. But Rocky's behavior continued to set him on edge. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, the house was once again consumed by normalcy. The kids were doing their homework, John was checking emails, and Emma was preparing dinner. The quiet hum of suburban life filled the house once again. The tension in the air had mostly dissipated, but Rocky remained on high alert. It wasn't until later in the evening that the family noticed the dog's behavior again. This time, Rocky's growling had returned, low and persistent. The sound rumbled from deep within his chest, a warning that couldn't be ignored. He was pacing in circles around the living room, eyes wide and fixed on the same spot, the floorboards beneath his paws creaking with each turn. "There he goes again," Emma said, her voice laced with concern. She was standing by the kitchen counter, eyes glued to her husband, who was still focused on his phone. John's head snapped up. "What now?" His eyes narrowed as he glanced toward the living room, his brow furrowing in confusion. I've never seen him act like this before, Emma continued, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Something's wrong, John. He's been like this for days. Rocky let out another sharp growl, this time louder, more forceful. The youngest of the Millers, Emily, was sitting on the couch, playing with her stuffed animals. When she saw Rocky's strange behavior, she jumped up and ran to her mother's side, grabbing her hand. "Mommy, what's wrong with Rocky?" Emily's voice wavered slightly as she looked nervously at the dog. Emma bent down to her daughter's level and smiled reassuringly. "It's okay, sweetie. Rocky's he's just being protective," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure herself. Meanwhile, Ethan rolled his eyes. "It's probably just a phase. Dogs act weird sometimes." But Luke, who had been quietly observing from the corner, spoke up. "No, Ethan. I've seen him act like this before." John looked at Luke, his brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Luke stood up slowly, his voice soft but steady. "He always acts like this before something happens. I don't know what, but he does." John blinked, staring at his son. "That's nonsense." But despite himself, doubt crept into his voice. That night, as the family settled down for bed, Rocky's behavior escalated. His barking became more frantic. He scratched at the door, growling deeply, pacing from one side of the house to the other. At around 2 a.m., as the rest of the family was still trying to sleep, Rocky's persistent barking woke everyone up. Emma rushed to the living room, shaking her head in disbelief. "Rocky! What is it?" she whispered. She bent down to try and calm him, but the dog ignored her, still fixated on something only he could sense. John walked in behind her, rubbing his eyes. "What is it, Rocky?" For a long moment, the dog just stared at him, his eyes full of intensity. The moment felt like time had stopped. Then, with no warning, Rocky's body went still, his ears pricking up. The room seemed to hold its breath. Suddenly, the ground shuddered, this time, more intensely than before. The walls rattled, and a loud crack filled the air as something inside the house shifted. The lights flickered, then went out completely. The earthquake had arrived. The ground seemed to tremble with a force that was almost unnatural. At first, it was a faint rumble, barely noticeable. But before anyone could react, the tremor became a violent shake that rattled everything in its path. The lights flickered, and the house seemed to groan under the pressure of the earth's fury. A sharp, ear-splitting crack echoed from somewhere deep within the walls, followed by the sound of glass shattering from the windows. For a moment, time itself seemed to freeze. Then, the shaking intensified, throwing the family off balance. Emma screamed, clutching Emily tightly in her arms, trying to shield her from the chaos around them. The floor beneath them seemed to undulate, and John fought to keep his footing, his arms instinctively reaching out to protect the ones he loved. But amidst the chaos, one figure remained calm. Rocky, the family's loyal German shepherd, was not running for cover. Instead, he barked fiercely, his deep, rumbling growls carrying through the tumult. His fur bristled as he paced nervously, darting between family members, nudging them, pushing them forward. His instincts were sharper than ever, sensing the shaking ground, guiding them like a silent protector. "Move! Now!" John shouted, his voice barely audible above the roaring tremor. But his commands were almost lost in the panic. The kids were frozen in fear, their legs shaky as they tried to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. "Rocky! What do we do?" Emma cried, her voice breaking as she tried to hold on to Emily, her eyes wide with fear. The dog was already at the door, pawing at it with urgency. He had seen this before, he knew what was coming next. He wasn't just barking at the disaster, he was telling them to move. He could sense the danger even before it hit. John grabbed Ethan by the arm, pulling him toward the door. "We need to get to the backyard, now." "What about Luke?" Ethan asked, panic rising in his voice. John's eyes darted to the hallway, where Luke had been standing just moments earlier, frozen in shock. But before he could act, the house shuddered again, more violently this time, and a heavy beam from the ceiling came crashing down, narrowly missing Luke, but knocking him to the ground. "Luke!" Emma screamed, rushing toward him. Rocky, already in motion, was at Luke's side in an instant, nudging him with his nose, encouraging him to get up and move. The dog's actions were instinctive, protecting his family, guiding them through the chaos. John quickly ran to Luke's side, lifting him up and pulling him toward the door. Luke's right arm was bleeding, a deep gash from where the debris had struck him, but there was no time for hesitation. The family was running now, but it wasn't a sprint, it was a frantic rush for survival. The walls of the house continued to groan, the foundation of their home shaking as if it were coming apart at the seams. But through it all, Rocky remained the calm in the storm, his body leading the way. Survival in the backyard. The moment they reached the backyard, the earth seemed to take a brief respite. The shaking subsided, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a silence. An eerie silence where the only sound was the heavy breathing of the family and Rocky's deep, comforting growls. The family was disoriented and scared, but they were out of the immediate danger of falling debris. John helped Luke sit on the grass, his hand gently pressing on the wound to slow the bleeding. Emma hovered over them, trembling, while Emily sat on the grass beside Rocky, who had finally calmed down. John looked around, trying to piece together what had just happened. "It's over. For now." His voice was hoarse, filled with exhaustion. But his eyes were wide, still processing the shock. "That was a big one," Ethan said, his face pale as he tried to steady himself. "What about the house?" Emma asked, her voice soft with worry. John shook his head. "We need to stay out here for now. We'll assess the damage later." But Rocky wasn't finished yet. He padded slowly toward the far corner of the yard, his ears perked, nose sniffing the air. His body seemed to be vibrating with the intensity of something else. It was almost as if he was trying to warn them again. "What's wrong, Rocky?" Emma asked, her voice gentle, but there was an underlying sense of dread. The dog turned to face them, his eyes filled with urgency. John followed Rocky's gaze. "There's another one coming." The ground had stopped shaking, but the air was thick with dust and the echoes of crashing debris. The Miller family was gathered in their backyard, trying to process what had just happened. The earthquake had torn through their neighborhood like an unstoppable force, leaving chaos in its wake. The house, though still standing, had been severely damaged, parts of the roof had caved in, windows were shattered, and the foundation had cracked. The most pressing concern, however, was Luke. His right arm was badly injured, blood seeped through the makeshift bandage John had wrapped around his son's arm. The injury wasn't life-threatening, but it was painful, and there was no telling when or if they'd be able to get medical attention. "It's going to be okay, Luke," Emma said softly, kneeling next to him as she held his other hand. Her voice wavered with fear, but she forced a calm tone. "We'll get you fixed up." Luke winced, but he nodded weakly. "I'm fine, Mom. Just a little sore." The shock was still written all over his face, though. He wasn't the only one. Ethan sat a few feet away, staring at the house in disbelief. His phone was in his hands, but the screen remained blank. There was no signal, no way to call for help, no way to reach anyone. The city's infrastructure was completely crippled. "We need to stay here for now," John said firmly. He was kneeling on the ground, checking over the damage to the house and trying to assess if it was safe to go back inside. His mind was racing. He had worked so hard to build this life for his family, and in a matter of seconds, it had all changed. But he couldn't allow himself to succumb to despair. Not now. Not when his family needed him. What if it happens again? Ethan asked, his voice quiet but laced with concern. He looked over at his father, but there was no comfort in his eyes. The teenager was struggling with fear that he didn't know how to express, a sense of powerlessness in the face of something far bigger than he had ever imagined. "We don't know yet," John said. His voice was calm, but the slight tremor in his hands betrayed his own anxiety. "We'll stay out here until it's safe. And we'll take care of each other." As John spoke, Rocky, who had been standing guard in the corner of the yard, suddenly barked, his ears perked up. His eyes were scanning the area, his body tense, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. "Rocky, what is it?" Emma said, turning toward the dog. She was still shaken, but she felt a strange sense of comfort knowing that the dog was here. Rocky had always been protective, but today, he seemed more attuned to their situation than ever before. The dog darted to the edge of the yard, sniffing the ground and the air, before turning his head to look back at the family. His eyes were wide, filled with a sense of urgency. John stood up and quickly walked toward him. "What's wrong, boy?" Rocky barked again, this time more sharply, as if trying to get them to move. "What is it?" Ethan asked, standing up from his seat. He looked over at his father, puzzled. "He's acting like he wants us to follow him." John glanced around. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, and the dust from the earthquake still hung in the air, but there was something else, something not right. A deep, guttural rumbling came from the earth beneath them. And then they felt it. The ground shuddered again, but this time, it wasn't a small tremor. It was a violent shake, and the house creaked ominously as if it were going to collapse any second. "Get to the street!" John shouted, as panic rose in his voice. "Now!" Without a second thought, the family sprang into action. Rocky led the way, darting through the yard and toward the front gate. The Millers followed, moving as quickly as possible, John and Emma each supporting one of the boys. Behind them, the house groaned again, and pieces of brick and wood began to crack and fall. The second earthquake hit hard, and they could feel the tremors reverberating through their bones. The street ahead was not much better, cracked pavement and debris scattered everywhere. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of gasoline and wood smoke filled the atmosphere. As the family reached the safety of the street, they looked around at the damage. Cars were flipped over, and homes that had once looked so sturdy were now piles of rubble. John grabbed hold of Luke, trying to steady him as he staggered, his arm still bleeding. "We have to keep moving," he said, his voice urgent but determined. "We need to find shelter." But as he spoke, a loud screeching sound rang out in the distance. The ground trembled again, but this time it was less intense. It was clear, aftershocks were coming, and they couldn't be certain when the next full quake would hit. Rocky stood at the edge of the street, his eyes scanning the area. The dog's instincts had saved them once, but would it be enough again? The family was shaken, physically and emotionally exhausted, but they couldn't afford to lose their focus. The aftershocks continued for hours, and the family was forced to take shelter in a nearby park, huddling together with strangers who had also sought refuge from the chaos. Rocky stayed by their side the entire time, his posture protective, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. As night began to fall, the air cooled, and the sounds of sirens and helicopters could be heard in the distance. The family was safe for now, but the reality of their situation was starting to set in. The earthquake had changed everything. But one thing was clear, Rocky was their savior, and his instincts, though once dismissed, had now proven themselves invaluable. Without his early warning, they might have been trapped, caught in the collapse of their own home. As the night wore on, Ethan looked at his father, his expression no longer one of rebellion. For the first time, there was a sense of gratitude. "You were right, Dad." Rocky, he knew what was coming. "He saved us." John nodded, his heart heavy with emotion. "He's more than just a dog, son. He's part of the family." The family settled down for the night, Rocky curled beside them, the loyal dog still watching over them, ever vigilant, ever protective. The world had gone silent in the wake of the earthquake, as if the ground had swallowed all the noise, leaving only the echo of tremors in the distance. The Miller family sat on a patch of grass in the park, the once lush greenery now interrupted by scattered debris. The smell of gasoline and burnt wood lingered in the air, a reminder of the devastation that had swept through the city. The aftershocks had subsided, but the air felt thick with the weight of what had happened. Ethan, sitting next to Luke, looked out at the wreckage with a vacant stare. His phone, once a constant companion, was now useless, no signal, no way to connect with the outside world. His hands were shaking slightly, the reality of the earthquake hitting him harder than he'd expected. "I didn't think it would be this bad," he said quietly, his voice distant. "I didn't think it would actually happen." "None of us did," John replied, his voice heavy. He sat beside Ethan, his eyes scanning the horizon. His posture was stoic, but the weight of the day's event seemed to be settling in, his shoulders slightly hunched. The father had always been the strong one, but now, faced with the destruction of everything he had worked for, he wasn't sure how to move forward. Emma sat a few feet away, her hand gently holding Emily's. The little girl had barely said a word since the earthquake. Her wide eyes were filled with fear, but she remained close to her mother, clutching her stuffed animal tightly. "How's your arm, Luke?" Emma asked, trying to focus on something other than the overwhelming fear that loomed over her. She had already bandaged her son's wound as best she could, but there was still blood on his shirt, and she wasn't sure if the injury was worse than it seemed. "It hurts, but it's not too bad." Luke winced, trying to downplay the pain, but it was obvious that the injury was more serious than he was willing to admit. The cut on his arm had bled heavily, and while the bleeding had slowed, it still looked bad. Rocky, who had been keeping an eye on the family from a distance, now walked over to Luke, nuzzling his side with his head. His comforting presence seemed to calm the boy, even if only for a moment. The dog had stayed beside Luke throughout the entire ordeal, his calmness and vigilance never wavering. John looked at Rocky with a mix of awe and gratitude. "He's been our rock through all of this." Emma nodded, her eyes misting. "He's more than just a dog. He's our protector." As the family sat together, trying to find solace in the small moments, the reality of their situation began to set in. The house, what was left of it, was a pile of rubble. The destruction wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The family had spent years building a life in that home, creating memories, and now it was all gone in the blink of an eye. "What do we do now?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. His voice was shaky, but there was a sense of urgency in his tone. John exhaled deeply. "We start over." "But where do we go?" Luke asked, his voice quiet but filled with concern. He looked at his father, searching for the strength to hold on to something, anything, that would give him a sense of stability. "We'll find a place to stay. For now, we'll stick together," John said, standing up. His legs were stiff from the long day, but he pushed through it, his eyes scanning the area as he tried to make sense of their next steps. "We'll figure it out. One step at a time." It wasn't long before the first responders began arriving. Fire trucks, police cars, and ambulances filled the streets, their flashing lights a sharp contrast to the chaos. Rescue teams were combing through the rubble, looking for survivors, while others began to establish temporary shelters in the park for displaced families. The Miller family was fortunate, they had escaped the worst of it, and they had Rocky to thank for that. He had kept them safe when they didn't know where to go. Now, as the first responders began their work, the family was given a place in the temporary shelter, a small tent set up alongside others who had been affected by the quake. As night fell, the family huddled together, trying to find comfort in each other's presence. John and Emma sat on a small bench, their arms around each other, while Ethan lay back, staring up at the stars, his mind still processing everything. Luke was trying to sleep, his injured arm propped up on a pillow, while Emily had finally drifted off, exhausted from the day's emotional roller coaster. Rocky, as always, stayed vigilant. He circled the family's small area in the shelter, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. There was a sense of peace in his actions, he wasn't just guarding them physically, but emotionally as well. His presence grounded the family, reminding them that despite the chaos, they were safe. John's eyes lingered on the dog for a moment before he turned to Emma. "I don't know what we would have done without him." Emma nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "He's been the one constant. He's never left us." The realization settled in like a weight. The family had survived the earthquake, but the emotional toll was only just beginning. The loss of their home, the fear for their safety, and the injuries they'd sustained, all of it was still very raw. But through it all, Rocky had been their unwavering protector, their savior, and their source of strength. The following day, the family began to make plans. They weren't sure what the future would hold or how they would rebuild, but they knew they had each other, and they had Rocky. He had saved their lives, not just with his ability to predict the earthquake, but with his constant presence, his loyalty, and his love. "We'll be okay," John said, looking at his family. There was no certainty in his words, but there was something else, a quiet determination that came from knowing that no matter how hard things got, they would face it together. Rocky sat at his side, his head resting against John's leg, his eyes still scanning the surroundings, always alert, always ready. And for the first time since the earthquake had struck, the Millers felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but with each other, and with Rocky, they would find a way through. The days following the earthquake passed slowly, each one marked by a new challenge. The city of Los Angeles was in chaos, with many parts of the city completely devastated. Power was out in several areas, roads were impassable, and countless families, like the Millers, were displaced. Yet, somehow, the Miller family felt a sense of thankfulness. They had survived, thanks in no small part to Rocky. While others scrambled to find shelter, food, and medical supplies, the Millers had managed to find a temporary place in a nearby community shelter, where they were able to stay for a few days. But even there, the true reality of their situation began to set in. There was no way to return to the house, it had been irreparably damaged. The home they had worked so hard to build was now just a memory. As the days wore on, John found himself stepping into a role he had never fully embraced, being the emotional center for his family. It was a responsibility he had never imagined taking on, not when life had been easy, not when they had everything they needed. Now, with the future uncertain and their lives turned upside down, John's sense of strength had to come from somewhere else. And that somewhere else, for now, was Rocky. On the third day after the earthquake, John took a quiet moment to himself. He walked to the edge of the shelter, his eyes scanning the horizon. He had always been the type to push through difficult moments, to focus on work and provide for his family. But today, he couldn't escape the weight of it all. The feeling of helplessness crept in, the feeling that he couldn't protect his family from something so beyond his control. But then he looked down. Rocky was sitting by his side, quietly watching him. The dog's eyes were filled with understanding, more than any human could offer. "You've been the strong one, Rocky," John said softly, his voice hoarse. He sat down on the ground beside the dog, who leaned his head against his leg. "But this is different. I can't rebuild everything in a day. And I don't know how to get them back to normal." Rocky shifted his head and looked at John with those knowing eyes. The dog didn't need words, his actions spoke volumes. He had always been loyal, protective, and ever present when his family needed him most. John had started to see Rocky not just as a dog, but as a true companion, a friend, and an irreplaceable part of their family. The following week, the Millers received news that they had been assigned a temporary living space, an apartment, not far from their old home. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They had a roof over their heads, food, and a place to start over. But there was still so much to rebuild, so much loss that would never be fully repaired. Luke was the first to speak up about the emotional toll. His arm was healing, but the emotional scars were harder to treat. The trauma of the earthquake had shaken him more than he realized. He had become withdrawn, spending more time alone in his room than before, and though he was physically healing, his emotional wounds were harder to address. One evening, as John was sitting in the new living room, the sound of footsteps caught his attention. It was Luke. His son had a blank expression on his face, but there was something different in the way he moved, something lighter. "Dad? Can we go for a walk?" Luke's voice was quiet but firm. John looked up from his seat, surprised. Of course. They stepped outside into the warm evening, the sound of distant sirens filling the air. It was strange, walking through a neighborhood that felt both familiar and foreign at the same time. The city was rebuilding, but it was still raw, still reeling from the devastation. As they walked, Luke finally spoke. "You know, Dad, I've been thinking a lot about Rocky." Luke's voice was softer now, his eyes on the ground. "When the earthquake happened, I thought I was going to die. I thought I wouldn't make it out. But Rocky, he knew. He knew something was coming." John looked at his son, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes. This was the boy who had always been the quiet one, but now, his emotions were laid bare. "Rocky did save us, son." Luke nodded, his voice trembling. "I don't know if I can ever repay him for that." "You don't have to." John placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Rocky's loyalty isn't something that can be repaid. He loves you. He's family. And family always has each other's back." The following weeks were filled with a strange mix of grief and hope. The Millers were still adjusting to their new living space, but each day felt like a small victory. They were surviving, and they had Rocky to thank for their continued safety. But Rocky's abilities were still a mystery. It was hard for the family to fully understand how he could predict the earthquakes with such precision. Could it be that his heightened sense of smell allowed him to detect the faint vibrations in the earth? Could he feel the subtle shifts in the atmosphere before anyone else? They didn't have answers, but what mattered most was that he had saved their lives. One afternoon, as the family sat together, trying to unpack boxes, Rocky walked up to John and placed his head on his lap, his eyes soft but filled with the same knowing intensity. John smiled, reaching down to stroke Rocky's head. "You're a good boy, aren't you?" he said, his voice full of emotion. In the months that followed, the Millers grew closer as a family. They learned to appreciate each other in ways they hadn't before. The bond between the family and Rocky grew deeper as they worked through their struggles and triumphs. John, once the stoic provider, began to open up more to his family, sharing his own vulnerabilities and fears. Ethan and Luke became more responsible, understanding the value of family and loyalty. And Emma, always the nurturing force, became the glue that held them all together, reminding them that no matter the hardship, they could face anything as long as they were united. A few months had passed since the earthquake that changed the course of the Miller family's lives. The initial shock had worn off, but the scars, both physical and emotional, remained. The family was beginning to find their rhythm again in the new apartment, and life was slowly returning to a new version of normal. Despite the chaos of the past few months, there was a sense of peace in the air now. The repairs to their former home were still ongoing, and though they would never be able to fully restore it to what it had been, there was something undeniably powerful about the new beginning they were forging. The family had been through so much together, and it had brought them closer than ever before. The bond between them had strengthened, and the bond with Rocky, their faithful German shepherd, had grown deeper. No longer just the family pet, Rocky was now seen as their protector, their hero. John, who had spent most of his life keeping his emotions in check, now found himself sharing more with his family. He talked openly about the fear he had felt when the earthquake struck, the uncertainty about the future, and the guilt he carried for not fully appreciating what he had until it was almost too late. Emma, too, had taken on a new perspective. She had always been the glue that held the family together, but now she was also the one who encouraged them to share their feelings and fears. She was helping them heal, and in the process, she was healing herself as well. And as for Ethan, the once rebellious 15-year-old had started to mature. The earthquake had changed him in ways he couldn't explain. He wasn't the same teenager who had shrugged off warnings and challenges with a sarcastic remark. Now, he was more thoughtful, more aware of what it meant to be responsible, not just to his family, but to the world around him. Luke, who had been the most visibly shaken by the events, was finally beginning to find peace. His arm had healed well, but it was the emotional scars that took longer to fade. Every day, he grew a little stronger, a little more confident, and his bond with Rocky was like a lifeline. The dog had been his constant through the storm, and every time he looked at Rocky, he was reminded of how lucky they all were to be alive. As the family sat together in the living room one evening, a new sense of calm filled the space. The TV was on in the background, the kids were chatting quietly, and Rocky lay by the door, his head resting on his paws. "I think we're finally getting back to normal," Ethan said, looking around the room. He wasn't just talking about the house or the repairs, he meant the family. He could feel the difference. There was no longer the weight of anxiety or uncertainty hanging over them. John nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, I think we are." He looked down at Rocky, who was now lying quietly, watching the family with attentive eyes. "But it's not just about rebuilding our house. It's about rebuilding ourselves. Together." As the weeks went by, the Millers found themselves facing new challenges, but this time they were facing them together. They had learned to appreciate the small things, a quiet evening at home, a walk through the neighborhood with Rocky, and the simple joy of being together. Even though their lives had been shaken to the core, they were now starting to realize that strength wasn't in the things they had, it was in who they had. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, John looked at Rocky, who was sitting under the table, waiting patiently for scraps. The dog's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, John felt a rush of gratitude. It was a feeling he hadn't fully understood before the earthquake, the feeling of thankfulness for the things that mattered most. "You know, I used to think I had to be the strong one. I thought I had to handle everything, keep everything together. But I've learned that real strength comes from being together. And from having Rocky by our side," John said, his voice full of emotion. Ethan, sitting across from his father, raised an eyebrow. "Are you finally admitting that I was right about the dog?" he teased. John chuckled, the first genuine laugh he'd shared with Ethan in a long time. "I don't know about that. But I will say this, Rocky saved us. He saved all of us. He's been amazing," Luke added, looking down at the dog who had been nothing but a loyal protector. "He's more than just a dog. He's family." "He's always been family," Emma said softly, her hand reaching over to Rocky and gently scratching behind his ears. "But now we truly understand what that means." In the months following the earthquake, the Millers did not only rebuild their home, they rebuilt their lives. They were more attuned to one another's needs, more conscious of the fleeting nature of time, and more aware of what really mattered. The family began to take weekend trips to the mountains, spending time together, exploring, and making memories in the places they had always wanted to visit but had never had the time for. Rocky accompanied them on every adventure, his presence a comforting reminder that they were never truly alone. One afternoon, while hiking up a trail near the mountains, Ethan and Luke raced ahead, with Rocky bounding beside them. They had long since stopped worrying about the earthquake, but now there was a sense of peace in their hearts, knowing that no matter what the future held, they had each other and Rocky to keep them safe. As they reached the summit, they all paused to look at the breathtaking view in front of them. Los Angeles sprawled in the distance, a sea of lights and buildings far below. The sky above them was streaked with orange and pink, as the sun began to set. "We made it, Dad," Ethan said quietly, standing beside John, his eyes on the horizon. John smiled, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Yeah, we did. And we'll keep making it, no matter what. With Rocky at our side, we can face anything," Luke added, glancing down at the dog who was sitting beside them, looking up at them with those ever-watchful eyes. Rocky let out a small bark as if in agreement. John chuckled softly, his heart full. "Yeah. With Rocky, we'll always be okay." And in that moment, as the last rays of the sun disappeared behind the mountains, the family felt a sense of peace, a deep knowing that they had everything they needed to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The sun had set, and the soft hum of the city outside filtered into the Miller family's new apartment. The days had become routine again. Rocky had settled into his role as the family's protector, always near them, always alert. The family had spent months recovering, both emotionally and physically. They were adjusting to their new life, learning how to live with the echoes of what had happened, and moving forward together. But even as they found normalcy, a lingering feeling of unease never completely left them. It was one late afternoon in early spring, when the days were getting longer and the air was filled with the scent of fresh flowers and new beginnings, that the first signs came again. The earthquake prediction wasn't as blaringly obvious this time. It wasn't a sudden outburst of barking or growling like before. Instead, it was subtle. Rocky had begun pacing again. At first, John hadn't paid much attention. Rocky had done this before, during their recovery phase, and it was always brushed off as just a dog being restless. But the closer Rocky got to the door, the more the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. "What's going on with Rocky now?" Emma asked, looking at the dog as he walked back and forth, his nose sniffing the ground like he was searching for something unseen. The dog's eyes were more focused now, more urgent than before. John wiped his hands on his pants, looking at the dog with a mixture of frustration and concern. "I don't know." He didn't want to admit it, but the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach was growing. The last time Rocky had acted like this, it had been only moments before the massive earthquake struck. Ethan, who had been sitting at the table, watching his phone, now stood up. "He's doing it again, Dad." John sighed, turning toward Rocky, who was now staring at the door, his ears alert. He had seen this before, and the feeling that he couldn't shake was becoming impossible to ignore. "I think you might be right, Ethan." The family gathered in the living room as Rocky continued his pacing, and Luke and Emily sat on the couch, trying to make sense of their dog's strange behavior. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the occasional scrape of Rocky's claws against the floor. Finally, Rocky stopped, sitting by the door and looking up at John. "We can't just ignore it this time, can we?" John's voice was quieter than usual, but the words hung in the air. He didn't want to panic the family, but the dog's behavior seemed far too intentional to dismiss. Emma nodded slowly, placing her hand on John's arm. "What do we do?" John took a deep breath. "We wait. If it's a false alarm, we'll just have to move on. But if he's right again..." Before he could finish his thought, the ground beneath them shuddered. It was light at first, like the faint tremors of a distant storm. But before they could react, it intensified, violent, like the earth itself was shifting beneath them. "Everyone get to the hallway, now!" John shouted, his voice full of urgency. The earthquake hit in full force just moments later, throwing them off their feet. The apartment building swayed, and the walls creaked loudly as if the whole structure was on the verge of collapsing. The tremors lasted longer than any of them had expected, the earth groaning and shaking beneath them as objects from the shelves tumbled to the floor. "Rocky!" Emma screamed, looking around frantically. She had to find her children, but the apartment was in chaos, everything shaking and falling. The world seemed to dissolve around her as she struggled to make sense of what was happening. But then, through the chaos, Rocky's familiar, reassuring bark cut through the noise. The dog had already dashed to Emily, who had stumbled backward in fear. Rocky nudged her toward the hallway with his snout, guiding her out of the danger zone. "Come on, Mom!" Ethan shouted, pulling his mother by the hand, and helping guide her to the safety of the hallway. John wasn't far behind, his eyes scanning the space for Luke, who was clinging to the couch as the apartment rocked around them. Luke, with Rocky's help, finally stood up and dashed toward the hallway as well. The dog was right there beside him, his strong body pushing through the shaking ground and guiding Luke to safety. The family huddled together in the hallway, but the quake didn't let up. It was as if the earth was relentless, forcing them to endure each jolt and tremor. Yet, Rocky remained calm. His body pressed up against the miller's, his presence a solid comfort. The dog's loyalty wasn't just physical, it was emotional, and in these moments, it was more important than anything else. When the shaking finally stopped, it was as if the whole world had been holding its breath, waiting for the storm to pass. The family stood there, breathless, their ears ringing, their hearts pounding. The world outside was silent. The tremors had subsided, but the air still carried a weight of unease. The city, which had been gradually coming back to life, was once again thrown into a state of emergency. People were shaking with fear, trying to understand the extent of the damage. John and the rest of the family slowly emerged from the hallway. Their apartment had been spared major structural damage, but there were cracks in the walls and shattered glass scattered across the floor. The familiar comfort of their living space was gone. Yet, they were alive. The family took stock of their situation, but it was clear, Rocky had saved them once again. "We need to get outside and assess the damage," John said, his voice steady but laced with worry. "But we're safe, and that's what matters." Rocky stood at John's side, his eyes scanning the space, watching over his family like the protective companion he had always been. As the family sat in the safety of the backyard, looking at the city that had once seemed so solid beneath their feet, the weight of the earthquake lingered. The Millers had faced the worst of nature's forces, but they had survived. John sat with Ethan and Luke beside him. The silence between them spoke volumes. "We can't ignore him anymore, can we?" Ethan said, breaking the quiet. "No," John replied. "We can't. We've learned the hard way that Rocky's instincts are something we should trust." Rocky sat in front of them, looking up at the family with those wise, knowing eyes. "Thank you, boy," Emma whispered, reaching down to pet him. "Thank you for always being there when we needed you most." And in that moment, the family knew, no matter what the future held, they would always have each other, and Rocky, to guide them through any storm. The days after the second earthquake felt like an endless blur. The aftershocks had subsided, but the emotional tremors lingered, leaving the Miller family grappling with what had happened. The physical damage to their new apartment was minor compared to the devastation they had endured in their former home, but the emotional toll was something that no amount of rebuilding could erase. John had spent the last few days checking in with the local authorities, trying to coordinate with the insurance company, and making sure the family was comfortable in the shelter. He was still the steady rock of the family, but he couldn't deny the exhaustion in his eyes or the deep sense of uncertainty that weighed on him. For Ethan, the second earthquake had hit him harder than the first. His usual deflection, his sarcasm, and rebellion, were all gone. He had lost his sense of control, and it made him more vulnerable than he had ever been before. The weight of the earthquake had cracked his walls, and now, he found himself questioning everything. Luke, on the other hand, had grown stronger. His arm was fully healed, but it was his emotional recovery that had been more significant. He had started talking more openly about what had happened, his fears, his regrets, and his hope for the future. It wasn't easy, but with each passing day, Luke grew more comfortable with the idea of moving forward. Emily, still too young to fully understand the gravity of what had happened, had become the heart of the family's recovery. Her infectious laughter, her boundless energy, and her innocent joy had reminded everyone about the simple things in life, the things worth fighting for. And through all of this, there was one constant. Rocky. Rocky had been their protector from the moment he had entered their lives. He had saved them twice now, first with his instincts during the first earthquake, and then by guiding them through the second, more violent quake. The dog had always been a loyal companion, but now, he was their silent hero, their anchor in the storm. It had been a week since the second earthquake, and the family had returned to the apartment, though the rebuilding process was far from complete. The neighborhood was still grappling with the aftermath, but life was slowly returning to a new normal. The Millers were adjusting, and so was Rocky. But the question that lingered in everyone's mind was simple: how do you rebuild after something so unpredictable, so devastating? How do you continue when the ground beneath you could shake at any moment? One evening, after dinner, as the family sat together in the living room, the weight of the silence settled over them. It had been a long day, filled with small tasks and attempts to regain a semblance of normalcy. But the emotional toll was real. John looked at his family, at Emma, Ethan, Luke, and Emily, and then at Rocky, who sat by the door, his watchful eyes scanning the room. He had never been more aware of how fragile life could be. "We've been through so much, haven't we?" John's voice was low, almost to himself. "Yeah." Ethan replied, his voice softer than it had been in weeks. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately. About everything." He met his father's eyes, a rare moment of vulnerability between them. "I guess I never really understood what you were going through until now." John's expression softened. "It's okay, son. You don't have to understand everything." Ethan looked at his father, his eyes full of understanding. "I get it now. I get that we need each other. I get that we're all just doing our best." He looked down at Rocky, who had moved to sit closer to them. "I'm sorry for the way I've been." "You're not the only one," John said quietly. "We've all had our moments." He turned to Luke, who was sitting on the couch, playing with a toy Rocky had brought him. "But we're all learning. We're learning to trust again. Trust each other." Luke nodded, his face softening. "And Rocky. We can always trust Rocky." His voice was filled with admiration as he stroked the dog's fur. Rocky's eyes met his with an unspoken understanding. "He's been our strength." Emma's voice was filled with gratitude as she stood up and walked over to where Rocky lay. "He's not just a dog anymore, he's family. He's a part of us." The family sat there for a long while, the weight of the past few weeks settling on them. But there was no more tension in the air. No more uncertainty. In that moment, they felt the power of their unity. They were not just a family surviving disaster, they were a family healing, growing stronger, and beginning to understand the true meaning of trust. Over the next few months, life for the Millers began to take shape again. They found new ways to cope, to move forward. They visited the old house where the first earthquake had torn their lives apart, but the memories of that day were fading, replaced by the new memories they were creating. Rocky continued to play his role as protector, guide, and companion. But now, he was more than just a dog with special instincts, he was a symbol of their survival, a reminder of the strength that came from within and the bond that held them together. John went back to work, and the kids returned to school. Slowly, the family found their routine again, but everything had changed, the way they loved, the way they lived, and the way they faced the world. One afternoon, as John and Ethan walked into the backyard, they both stopped to watch Rocky, sitting by the gate, watching over them, his posture regal and strong. "You know, Dad, I think we're going to be okay," Ethan said, his voice calm, as if he'd come to terms with what had happened. John smiled softly, placing his hand on his son's shoulder. "Yeah, son. I think we are." And in that moment, as they looked out at the horizon, feeling the warm sun on their faces, hearing the rustling of the trees, and the faint sound of traffic in the distance, they knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. And with Rocky by their side, there was no challenge too great to overcome. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden glow over the Miller family's new life. The days of uncertainty and chaos were behind them, and in their place was a new chapter, one of healing, hope, and renewed strength. The Millers had finally found peace in the aftermath of the earthquakes, and they were beginning to understand what truly mattered. John and Emma stood together on the porch of their new home, looking out at the horizon. The city, once a chaotic blur of destruction, now seemed like a world they could live in again. It had taken months to rebuild, not just their house, but their lives. But now, as they looked out at the quiet morning, they both felt a sense of gratitude and calm. "I can't believe how far we've come." Emma's voice was soft, her hand resting on John's. John smiled, his eyes filled with emotion. "We've been through a lot, haven't we?" He paused, his gaze turning to the horizon. But I think we're stronger now. Stronger than we've ever been. Yeah. Emma nodded, a smile tugging at her lips. And we have each other, and Rocky, to thank for it. As if on cue, Rocky came trotting over, his tail wagging and his ears perked. The German Shepherd had always been the rock of their family, and now, more than ever, he was their symbol of loyalty, strength, and protection. He sat down at their feet, looking up at them with those ever-knowing eyes. He saved us. Twice. John said quietly, reaching down to scratch behind Rocky's ears. I don't think we'll ever fully understand how or why he has these abilities, but I don't think we need to. What matters is that he was here for us. And he always will be. He's part of the family, Emma added, her voice thick with emotion. More than a dog. More than just a protector. He's our companion, our hero. Rocky looked up at them, his tail wagging even faster as if in agreement. His loyalty was undeniable, and the Millers now fully understood the depth of their connection. Over the next few months, the Millers continued to rebuild their lives. The scars of the earthquake were still visible, both in their home and in their hearts, but they had found a new way to live. They had learned to appreciate the small things, family dinners, walks in the park, quiet moments of reflection. Luke had returned to school, and while the memories of the disaster still lingered, he had grown more confident and resilient. His bond with Rocky had deepened, and every day, he was reminded of how precious life was. He had become more open, more willing to face his fears and express his emotions. His injury had healed, but it was his emotional growth that had truly shaped him into a stronger person. Ethan, too, had changed. He had started to take on more responsibility, no longer the rebellious teenager he once was. The earthquake had broken through the walls he had built up, and he had begun to see the importance of family, loyalty, and trust. Though he still had his moments of uncertainty, he was becoming the young man his family had always hoped he would be. And Emily, as always, remained the bright light in the family's life. Her joy, her innocence, and her endless curiosity had given the Millers something to hold on to when everything else felt uncertain. Her bond with Rocky was unbreakable, and she had become his greatest companion in the household. The family had not only survived the earthquake, they had grown. They had become more than just a group of individuals who lived together. They had become a team, a unit, bound by love and by the unshakable loyalty of the dog who had saved them all. It was a Saturday morning, and the Millers were out for their usual weekend hike. They had discovered a new park on the outskirts of Los Angeles, a peaceful retreat from the busy city life. The park was nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, offering a calm, serene escape from the chaos of the world. The family walked together, with Rocky leading the way, as he always did. His nose was constantly to the ground, his instincts sharp as ever. The family had learned to trust his every move, knowing that he was always looking out for them. "This place is perfect," Ethan said, looking around at the lush greenery. "It's peaceful. I think I could get used to it here." "Me too," Luke added, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "It's nice to just be outside and not have to worry about anything." John nodded, a rare moment of contentment settling in his chest. "Yeah, it's good to have a place like this. A place where we can just breathe." As the family reached the top of the hill, they paused to take in the breathtaking view. Los Angeles stretched out before them, a city that had once felt so fragile. But now, standing at the top of that hill, the family felt a deep sense of peace. They had made it through the hardest part. The earthquakes, the uncertainty, the loss, it had all led them to this moment. And in this moment, they were together. They had survived. And they had Rocky to thank for that. "We'll be okay, won't we, Dad?" Luke asked, looking up at his father with a smile. John wrapped his arm around Luke's shoulders, pulling him close. "Yeah, son. We will." Rocky, standing at the edge of the hill, looked back at the family, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. He had always been their protector, but now, he was also a symbol of everything they had survived, a reminder of what truly mattered: family, loyalty, and love. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden light over the world, the Millers knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. With Rocky by their side, they were ready for whatever came next. What would you do if your dog could predict a disaster before it happened? The bond between Rocky and his family was tested in the most unimaginable way, but through the chaos, they learned that loyalty and love can survive even the toughest trials. Let us know what you think in the comments below. How far would you go to protect the ones you love? Don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming stories of bravery, survival, and the incredible connection between humans and animals. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. How did Rocky's unwavering loyalty inspire you today?